Welcome to today's episode of Nature Connects with myself, Jeanette Sutherland. I'm delighted to have Angela Gall, Senior Marine Advisor for Natural England and the author of the enchanting children's book, Allis Shad, Who Wouldn't Give Up. Joining me later is Dr. William Darwall, Tamara Landscape Partnership Scheme Manager and Researcher, whose work with IUCN has been pivotal in red-listing the Atlantic salmon. Their combined expertise and passion for marine conservation make them perfect guests as we celebrate World Fish Migration Day on May the 21st. In this episode, we spotlight two remarkable species associated with the River Tamar, the Atlantic salmon and the Allis Shad. These species are not only vital to the river's ecosystem, but also symbolise the incredible journey of life and migration, which is why they are two of our 17 special species in our nature recovery plan. Join us as we dive into the fascinating life cycles of these Tamar Valley special species and explore the dedicated conservation work aimed at supporting their migration and population growth in the River Tamar. Angela and Will share their insights and experiences, shedding light on the importance of protecting these endangered species and inspiring us all to take action for a healthier, more sustainable future. Well, I'm absolutely delighted to be stood down on the banks of the Tamar, just below Gunners Lake Weir, with Angela Gall. We're slightly distracted because there are kingfishers tooting and peeping and whizzing around. We think they must have a nest here, so if things go quiet, it's because we're watching the kingfishers. So, good morning, Angela.
Good morning, lovely to be here.
So we're here today to have a chat about Allis Shad. As one of our special species and as we approach World Fish Migration Day, it just feels incredibly important that we're discussing this species and raising the profile around what is happening with their population and with their habitat in the Tamar Valley. So if we could just start off with you telling us a bit about Allis Shad.
Well, Allis Shad are probably quite an unknown species of fish to most people, but they are really special. They're a member of the herring family. So they're a silvery fish, get up to about 60 centimetres long, and they have a bluey green back and some spots behind the gill covers. And they're related to another species of shad that we get in this country called the Thwaite shad. Maybe that's slightly more common and better known to some people, but they are a pretty rare species these days, and this is the perfect place to be talking about them because the Tamar is a real stronghold for this species.
So you've described a bit about its physical features, so also its life cycle.
Well, this is one of the most exciting things, and that's why we're talking about it for World Fish Migration Day. So they're an anadromous species. That means that they spend the majority of their adult life out at sea, and then they'll return to the river of their birth to spawn. So they've got this amazing biochemistry in their bodies that allows them to move between freshwater and saltwater, and they swim through that whole range of different environments. And I think that's what makes them quite an exciting representative of a whole range of ecosystems and allows us to tell the story of those ecosystems through this fish's migration.
If we can zoom out for a moment and talk about where they are globally and then zoom back into the Tamar Valley.
So globally, they are vulnerable on the IUCN red list, and so they've really decreased in numbers globally. They have a range that extended from Scandinavia down to the Iberian Peninsula, so quite a lot of European rivers support them or once supported them, but throughout their range they are threatened by a number of different pressures. And in this country, the Tamar is a real stronghold. Until recently, it was the only known river in the whole country where they spawn. But recently, there's been some evidence that they also spawn in the Tor in North Devon, which is exciting to find out. There's a lot that isn't known about them. The Tamar is a place probably where they've been the best studied so far.
Yeah. So the global pressures, what would you say are those on the shads as well as other species?
Well, because of their life cycle and having to move between rivers and sea, they face threats both in those rivers and at sea. So as adults, they can be subject to overfishing. We don't know too much about where they go as adults and how much they're caught in the open ocean. But when they're in the rivers particularly, they suffer from the effects of pollution. They're very sensitive species, and sewage, agricultural runoff, things like that can damage their habitats. They're also really sensitive to noise. So in a very noisy river or estuary, that could potentially be a barrier to their migration. It could stop them moving in the direction that they need to move. Things that can stop them being able to move up from estuaries into the rivers to spawn are things like weirs and dams. And this is the case right across their range, where they are being blocked from accessing their typical spawning habitats by these large structures that they're unable to get up.
What is it that's stopping them from being able to get up?
Well, Allis Shad are good swimmers, but they're not able to leap. So they can't leap up a barrier like a salmon might be able to. But even salmon, a larger fish, will struggle with some of these barriers. There's just a sheer wall in their way and there's no way around it. So yes, Allis Shad, even quite a low weir or dam could present an obstacle to them. It might be that they could get up it on some states of the tide, but that they would have to wait until the water levels are right or the flow levels in the river are right. And all of that just reduces their opportunities of being able to get up into the river to spawn.
So can you, for our listeners, just go into a little bit more detailing in that range of habitat that the shad requires?
Yes, Allis Shad for their spawning have quite specific habitat requirements. So they really need a fast-flowing river and well-oxygenated, clean gravels. And the clean element is really important. If a river is polluted and there's algal overgrowth or not enough oxygen in the gravels, then it's not going to be suitable for spawning. So they are looking to be able to get up into freshwater reaches of rivers and above the tidal limit and use these areas of shallow gravel banks for the eggs to settle. So they will spawn in a deep water pool and then the eggs drift just downstream onto gravel banks nearby. And then because they move through so many different environments in their lifetime, they need that whole system to be clean, free of obstacles. So that goes right from the freshwater river where they're born right out to the open sea.
And that's something we're all striving for all species, including ourselves, isn't it? Is fresh, clean water is high on everybody's
Absolutely,
list.
yes, certainly on the Allis Shad's list.
Yes.
The other thing they need is as their larvae and then juveniles in the estuary and then moving down through the estuary out to say somewhere like Plymouth Sound in the case of the Tamar, they need habitats to be able to live in at these different stages of their life cycle. So that might be in the salt marshes or in the wet woodland around the margins of the river, and then as they develop they might hide in the seagrass beds, and these are places that they're safer from predators. So again, the whole system needs to be healthy in order for the Allis Shad to thrive. So when you have Allis Shad in a river, it is a very good indicator of a healthy ecosystem, because they're sensitive and they have so many habitat requirements.
It's then, as you're describing, I can visualise and see it in my mind, that mosaic of water habitats that is required. It isn't just a case of a river, it's all the microhabitats within it.
Yes, it's all important to them.
So from spawning to Allis Shad getting out to Plymouth Sound, what's that timescale?
Yeah, well, you could ask that, and I don't think we really know. I think there's a lot that's quite unknown still about the Allis Shad. It's possibly been estimated a couple of years. We're learning more all the time. There's some researchers at Plymouth University who've been catching different life stages of Allis Shad in the Tamar recently, and so we're learning about where they might be at different times of year and at different stages of their life cycle, but there's still so much else to learn. So much more research needed to really understand how best to conserve them.
So what are the main conservation concerns for the shad?
The main conservation concerns for shad, if I focus on the Tamar, which is where they are a protected feature of the marine protected area. So they are one of the reasons that the special area of conservation has been put in place here in the Tamar estuary and Plymouth Sound. But so that's really positive, but they still do face threats. Water quality is incredibly important to them. Sound barriers to migration could be a risk, particularly as they have to pass a very busy, noisy city on their way up to their spawning grounds. But the main thing that the Allis Shad struggles with in the Tamar is the fact that they very rarely able to get over the big weir at Gunners Lake. It's a real barrier to their migration. We know from habitat surveys that we've done that above the weir there's lots of suitable habitat, and we know from other countries that ideally that is where Allis Shad would be spawning, up above the tidal reaches in the freshwater river. But we have very few occasions when we know that Allis Shad are able to pass that weir. So most of the spawning that we know about takes place below the weir, and that's not optimal for them. So the population is probably smaller than it should be as a result.
Well, I guess that's a perfect opportunity for us to leave the riverbank where we are, and we'll walk up to the weir and carry on our discussion up there. So we've walked along only 150, 200 yards up to the weir. It's a low tide, so the river is lower at the moment. We've got the kingfishers coming up, we think perhaps to feed. So Angela, it'd be really good as we're stood here and almost the white noise of the weir in the background, to talk about the challenges and barriers that Allis Shad face during the migration, but specifically, I guess, as we're stood here at Gunners Lake Weir, just the context behind that.
Yeah, it's interesting to be back here and you can hear that weir. It's a big, powerful thing. It's a wall in the water, isn't it? And it really is an obstacle to these fish that can't leap. There is a fish pass on this weir. There's two, in fact, one older than the other, and they were designed for salmon, sea trout. So those species can pass the weir, and that sort of obstacle for them has been recognised for a long time. But what we know about the Allis Shad is that very, very few of them make it over this weir. They need to, that their optimal spawning habitat is above the weir, but they're just not powerful enough swimmers. They can't leap. They don't like very turbulent water. So it's a real challenge for them. We think perhaps that they only make it up when the flow conditions are calm and the tides are big spring high tides, and perhaps that helps them to get over. But generally, most of them, from what we know, are having to spawn below the weir. And that means that this little stretch of river that we've just walked is incredibly important to this species, to the survival of this species, in fact, in the UK. They're very vulnerable being constrained to such a small area. So what an impact could potentially wipe out the whole population. Imagine a pollution event at the wrong time of year when they're spawning there. They're very vulnerable. So this is what we think is the biggest threat to them on the Tamar. They do face other pressures. Even if we could get them above the weir, it's not all plain sailing for them. But the biggest thing that we could do to help safeguard the future of this species is to be able to get them up above this weir at Gunners Lake into their preferred spawning habitat.
And to allow it to expand. Yeah, to have choice. Exactly. Okay, so with those challenges and barriers in mind, what can we do, or what is happening as part of your role? What next?
There's lots that we can do, and I think the most immediate thing is getting them up this weir. And there is a project, South West Water are trying to push through a project to help the Allis Shad, and they will install a fish pass which has been specifically designed to aid their migration. So it's got slower water flow. It's differently designed to the salmon pass. It's got baffles in places where the water's slower, where the fish can take a rest on their way up, and a much more gentle gradient up the weir. It's been really designed with this species in mind, and also another species that is quite special to the Tamar, which is the cucumber smelt. Right. So they're another migratory fish that we have here, really struggling with the same issue. They would like to be up in the non-tidal part of the river, and again, they can't get past this barrier. So the design of the fish pass is to help multiple species. So it will still help the salmon and the sea trout, the marine lampreys, and it will also help eels and the shad and the smelt. So if we could get this in place, then there'd be so much less to worry about, because they'd have that choice. They'd have those options of different habitats to spawn in, and the pressure on them would be much reduced. We're really hopeful that would boost the populations. Yeah.
And it's, as we were saying earlier, it's pulling back together those threads, that web of life, that if by enriching and increasing the biodiversity in what species can move within the river, that then is going to attract and support other species within the water and terrestrial.
Yeah, it's all connected. The things that you do to improve a river for Allis Shad will help multiple species. So the more natural a river is, the better it is for the Allis Shad, the better it is for other species. And the cleaner, again, the water quality, it's something. So there's something we can all influence and do something about. It's being really cautious about what we put into our waterways, what we put down our drains, and that cleaner water would benefit all of the species within this ecosystem.
Absolutely, and I'm just thinking what we can do as individuals, if people are listening to the podcast, is that we're hoping that we're giving a balanced and an informed view on what is going on and how it is important that we all understand and have the facts and the information before making decisions around how we can potentially change, for example, the weir and the fish pass to support not only the shad but multiple species.
Yes, I think awareness is really key. I really would like people, particularly living around the Tamar, to know and be aware of the Allis Shad, because it should be a really iconic species for this area. We should be really proud that this is one of the last remaining strongholds of this species, and I just don't think people know much about it. So that was one of the reasons I decided to write a children's story. I really wanted to spread the word about this special fish that lives here.
Yes. Yeah, well, a great opportunity then to talk about your book. Obviously, I've read it multiple times and love it. I think to get it into the education system, and like you say, for all ages, it's a book for the whole family. So tell us a bit more about how the book came about and the journey of that.
Well, yeah, it was really that realisation that people didn't know what I was talking about when I mentioned Allis Shad around here, and it just all came into my head one day as a poem. And I think because it had been bubbling away for a long time, I'd been worried about this fish and thinking about the problems that it faces. And I think the thing about a children's book is that it is something that can be shared by families. Children's books are often read multiple times because it's been beautifully illustrated by a lady called Sarah Gledhill. She's done a wonderful job of that, so it's really nice to look at. So from quite a young child could still get something out of it with their parents reading it to them, and then hopefully my hope is that those parents are also absorbing those messages, and that between the children and the parents, that the messages in the book are understood at different levels.
Yes. Yeah, it's definitely, with children's books, what I love so much about it is it's got that element of adventure and that journey, but actually the fact that this is real, this is really happening, and it's a place that people know that we can connect with. So in turn, we should then be able to have an impact and give support too.
So it was really nice to be able to do the book. Did the book through Natural England, and so I was supported to do that through my work. I don't therefore need to make any money from the book, but what's been lovely is that it can support the West Country Rivers Trust, and they're a charity who are doing some fantastic work to conserve rivers and species like the Allis Shad. So it's really closely linked to the subject of the book, so they get anything that comes from the book goes to them, which is great. I loved being able to use the Allis Shad in this story because it ranges through so many habitats, and my background is in the marine environment, and obviously there's parts of the story when the Allis Shad is out at sea. Another thing I really wanted to showcase was those fabulous underwater habitats and landscapes that we have just off Plymouth. So again, it's so local to people, but they might be surprised at the colour and the vibrancy and the diversity of the reefs and the seagrass beds. So it was really lovely to be able to include all of that within one story.
Yeah, absolutely. I certainly feel from my experiences within teaching is that there is a need for books like Allis the Shad that is, again, connecting children and young people with nature on their doorstep that they may not even know exists, that we focus a lot on tropical species. Again, yes, the endangered species and habitats, but that is also happening on their doorstep, and I just feel so strongly that if we can start close to home, that's then where there is hope for the future, because it empowers our young people to feel that they can make a difference because it's close to home rather than on the other side of the world.
Exactly. I really hope so. One of the lovely things that's happened since writing the book was being able to work with the Children's Theatre Company, the Soapbox Children's Theatre Company in Plymouth. And they took the story and made a show of it. And they've been working in schools and bringing schools to their theatre, and they've been to the Tamar River Festival and delivered this lovely show that's very interactive. They get the children to become shad and to become lots of the different species within the book, and then they act it out to their parents. So it's just another iteration, another way of communicating, which I think has been really powerful. I love seeing it.
Yeah, fantastic. So as we come towards the end of our walk along the river, it'd be really good just to think about where next for the Allis Shad. What are your hopes, and as you move forward in your research and the work you're doing, and even with the book, where is Allis going to go?
Well, I really hope that we're going to be able to get Allis up this big weir. That, in the short term, is the most important thing. And beyond that, we need to look at whether there are other obstacles. We need to understand more about how the shad are using the river and the estuary so that we can better protect them. So some more research, and perhaps also in other places where we're beginning to understand that the Tor estuary is important for them. So expanding and using some of the lessons we've learnt here. There was a really successful project on the River Severn about the Allis Shad's cousin, the Thwaite shad, and that was called Unlocking the Severn. And they had an amazing programme of awareness and education in schools. I'd love to do more of that. I think it's really important. I hope that we can join up with the Plymouth Sound National Marine Park. They've got national lottery funding for work, including work to raise awareness of Allis Shad. So we'd love to work with them, and I hope that will be a good opportunity to spread some of the messages from the book and to do more of that engagement of communities, because I just think people need to know about this species. If they knew it was here and that it was a special thing that was right on their doorstep, then they could be very proud of that.
Absolutely, and that ties really nicely into the final element of our chat, which I ask all our guests. So within the work that I'm doing, we're looking at nature connectedness and just trying to support our communities in being able to access and to connect with nature. And I would be really keen to know if you're happy to share, just in our walk this morning, the time we've spent down at the river, of 3 things in the time we've had that have helped you to feel connected to nature here down on the river.
Well, thank you so much for bringing me here, because it's an easy place to connect with nature. It's all around us, and it's been really, really lovely here this morning. And I think all of the senses have been triggered. So there's a wonderful smell of wild garlic, and it's spring. The woods are absolutely full of flowers at the moment. So it's looking really green, really lush and vibrant. There's the sound of the river, and looking at the spawning gravels of the Allis Shad. Of course, I know this is a special place for shad, but it's so lovely to come back here. I don't live near here, so it's lovely to be here and to be reminded of how important this place is. And obviously it is a species that I feel connected to. And cherry on the cake was, of course, the kingfishers, which we heard first and then saw and got very excited about. And they've just been up and down the entire time that we've been talking here. So that's really magical.
Yeah, wonderful. Well, I feel very much the same. Another very special place in the Tamar Valley, and that we hope that people listening come and have an explore. Come down to Gunny's Lake Weir and put the pieces together on what we've spoken about this morning and enjoy and learn. Thank you so much for your time this morning. It's been wonderful just to be here and to listen and to learn, and I hope that moving forward we can all go that bit further and do that bit more for Allis Shad and all those other species that need the River Tamar.
My pleasure, I hope so too.
Thank you. As we walk away from the weir, and the river steadily flowing on the left of us, the early morning rain is dripping from the freshly opened canopy above our head. It seems a perfect opportunity to take our regular slot to connect with nature. So if you can, take a moment or two to pause, engage and connect. So after a wonderful morning with Angela talking about the shad, I've now been joined by Will further on down the river to have a chat about World Fish Migration Day and Atlantic Salmon. Good afternoon, Will.
Good afternoon, Jeanette.
Thank you so much. Me dragging you away from the office.
Yes, terrible hardship. Yes.
To be down here, but I just know how important it is for the podcast, for the national landscape, for Tamara to be having this conversation. So if we could start off by just talking about World Fish Migration Day and the importance and the narrative behind it.
Okay, well, World Fish Migration Day, for all those people who love fish, like me, the fishy freaks, is a really important day, and it's a global event. Happens every 2 years, and I mean truly global. I was involved in it in the past, and we once had a Teams session that followed the sun across the world, having reports from all around the world of stories on migratory fish. Wow. And the sort of purpose of it all is to raise awareness, first of all, that we have migratory fish migrating phenomenal distances. I think the world record in freshwater migration is 7,500 kilometres in the Amazon. Actually, I think it may even be miles, which is even more. So it's not just the birds we think about in the wildebeest migrating. There's probably over 1,000 fish globally that undergo big migrations, and that's we're talking about in freshwater here really, but they go from freshwater to the sea or sea to freshwater. And we need to bring attention because, well, I always like to, you've got the analogy of the tropical forests of the world like the lungs of the world, or the rivers are like the arteries of the world, and the fish going up and down them are like our little blood cells going up and down the rivers, but they get blocked. And this is one of the big deals, is the dams. We get mega dams around the world for hydropower. Fantastic renewable energy, but it's not quite as green as people might think, because it does block off these phenomenal migration routes for all these fishes. So this is to raise awareness and stories from all around the world on what people can do about it. And it has really stimulated this dam removal initiative, which is amazing, I think. Just to give you an idea, in Europe alone, there's more than 1 million barriers in the rivers, of which about 100,000 serve no purpose anymore. And if you narrow it down to come more closer to home, like the Tamar catchment and so on, a lot of those barriers were for mills, and we don't use our mills now, but the barriers are still there. So there's a big initiative to try and remove some of these barriers that are serving no real purpose anymore, and to allow these fantastic fish species to get up the rivers, to spawn, and get back down the river again. The reason there's such a big concern is that organisations track declines or increases in species over the years, and there's one called the Living Planet Index, which is really driven by WWF. And since about 1976 till more recently, they've been tracking abundance of individuals within species, of all selected groups of all animals and plants. And they've done a more recent look at the migratory fish, and they have the biggest decline of anything recorded, 81% down over the last 40, 50 years on the numbers we used to have. We don't see them, is the thing. They're all normally under the water here. In the good old days, you used to see the salmon jumping the weirs, which you still can, but you're be luckier to see it now. But generally, you don't notice, block off a river, you don't realise the fish are trying to get up.
Yeah, it's that out of sight, out of mind.
Exactly. Yeah. But the encouraging thing about it is when you remove a dam, the return of biodiversity, especially the fish, is so fast that it gives you hope. Yeah. I mean, had an example from a river in Maine in the US, another river herring, and I think on this particular river there were basically no fish getting through up to their spawning areas upstream. They removed a couple of dams, and now there are, 3 or 4 million. That's within a few years. And also talking to some of my colleagues in West Country Rivers Trusts, who have a big presence on the Tamar Valley, just removing little culverts, allowing access through. Talking to one of them, who said you're removing the culvert, and you see the fish actually coming through instantly, getting into areas they couldn't previously get up to. And a lot of these are migratory fish.
Yeah. So it's that making the space and the connectivity.
Yes, a lot of the big long rivers of the world, they're no longer free-flowing anymore. No. There are barriers.
So what is the relevance to the River Tamar with migratory fish?
The River Tamar does have 5 well-known species of migratory fish. And when we're talking about migration here, we're talking about fish that either come into the rivers, come up to the little streams up the top to spawn and breed, and then the eggs hatch out, grow up, and the young then head out to sea, grow big and fat, eating lots of goodies, and then they come back up the rivers again. But it can be in reverse. And so the first of the species, I can mention the European eel, which unfortunately is one of our threatened species again. It's critically endangered, massive declines. But they actually grow big up the top of our rivers. They can actually cross land on a wet, damp night and get into ponds and little streams. So they grow big up there, and then they go to sea to breed. And in fact, they go to one place, the Sargasso Sea off Central America, which is extraordinary migration. And there they breed, and then the young may spend a year floating around in the currents, Gulf Stream, coming back to the rivers where they came from. And they'll come up the rivers as elvers, and you can see them on the Tamar. In fact, I was told in April this year there were some good numbers of elvers coming up the Tamar, which is really great. Yes. So that's one of our...
And that you could see them climbing up.
Amazing. All the migratory fish are very determined to get to where they want to go.
Yes.
So that's the first one. Then we talked about the Allis Shad with Angela earlier. That's another of our migratory species. And we also have lampreys here. We've got the river lamprey, but also the marine lamprey. The river lamprey goes all the way upstream, and the marine lamprey, which is much bigger, probably you go a couple of feet long, quite thick. They're the stuff of the alien movies. The mouth is like these machines that dig tunnels through the earth, just circular with rows and rows of teeth, and because they're parasitic on other fish, stuck onto the side. But they come up around this time of year actually, and you can see them spawning below the weir here. We also have the smelt, which is more estuarine downstream, and then we come to the Atlantic salmon and the sea trout and brown trout, and they're all found in the river here. and we can delve into the life of the Atlantic salmon a bit more.
Okay, wonderful. So if you could tell us a bit more about those two special species, the Atlantic salmon and the sea trout.
I'll start just with the sea trout initially, because the interesting thing is we also have brown trout, but sea trout and brown trout are the same species. And in this case, brown trout, which are the ones you'll see up in the little tributaries and upstream, they can decide to grow up their whole life in freshwater and breed in freshwater. Or there's an alternative strategy where they might think, it's better to go to sea, and you go to sea and there's a lot more food at sea, and they get much bigger, feeding on krill and other crustaceans and so on. So they go out to sea for a little while, get much bigger, and then come back up the river as sea trout. And they look quite different to a brown trout. Yeah. They go all silvery, which is part of this amazing physiological change they have to do to be able to survive in salt water. So the brown trout, you see, some of them will stay, a lot of them will stay upstream, and some of them, sea trout, go to sea, get big, and then come back up again to breed and spawn.
So do we know is there anything specific that triggers their innate sense to either stay in the river or go out to sea?
It's more of a genetic balance, really. It's all about having the most young fish that you pass on, passing on your genes, really. And it's a sort of alternative strategy you could have, that it may be better to stay in the fresh water because there's much less predation risk, but you won't grow as big. So some will do that, and others, genetically, the genes are passed on for them to go to sea. Much higher risk of mortality at sea, but they've got a better chance of coming back much bigger, and then they have many more eggs. So that's just a different strategy. It's interesting stuff.
Amazing.
And moving on to the salmon, these are fish that, just to be clear, different to the eel. These ones spawn in the freshwater, grow up in freshwater, go to sea for a different number of years, then come back and breed in freshwater. But some salmon, when they're little, they're called par, will not go to sea at all, and they will fully mature in freshwater as little mini salmon. And when the big salmon come up to spawn, the little guys, nobody notices, and they sneak in there, and they will spawn at the same time and fertilise a number of the eggs, because the big male salmon who might be defending their spawning area against other males won't notice them. So they sneak in there. There's a description for them which I can't say on this podcast, but it's quite entertaining. But they're little sneakers, yeah. So just generally on salmon, for those that don't know, there are actually 6 species of Pacific salmon, which are not found here. That's in the sort of US and so on. And the Atlantic salmon, which is found all over northern Europe, up to Greenland areas, and in Canada. And also there's a few remaining in North America, but not many, almost all gone there. So their life cycle, as I say, they will spawn in, the male and female will come up our rivers to the small tributaries. Female will dig a little, technical terms are red, but they clear away the gravel and a little indentation there and lay the eggs in there, which then hatch out after 150 days or so, depending on temperatures, into little things called alevins, which have little egg sacs hanging off them, and they grow bigger and come out of the gravel and turn into fry. They grow a bit bigger and turn into the par, and they'll spend a couple of years in the river maybe, and they're the ones that look a little bit like brown trout, but we've got sort of dark bars on their side. And then the amazing thing happens when they turn into what we call a smolt. That's when these par decide the time to go to sea, which is about this time of year actually, and they'll start travelling down the river, and they change. They go longer, their fins get darker, they get a silvery colour, and their physiology changes to adapt them for the sea. So they all head out to sea, and then they can spend maybe a year. If they come back after a year, there'll be the smaller ones, and those are called the grilse. Or they can spend several years at sea, and they'll be called multi-sea winter fish, and they tend to be the bigger ones, which will come up normally in the springtime. And that's all another strategy. How long do we stay at sea?
Right.
Because the issue is that predation or mortality at sea is quite high. So the longer you stay, the more risky it is. But the longer you stay, the bigger you get, and the more eggs you have. So that's their basic life cycle.
Nature is amazing.
It is. And just to say the migrations, they all go up to areas like Greenland, sea around Norway, and that could be migrations of 2,500 miles. And something that I think a lot of people know, but they come back generally to the exact same river where they were born, which is amazing, really. You think, how do you, way out at sea, how do you track your way back? And I think it's through sort of chemical cues in the water, in the currents, and when you come to your river, they can taste the river.
That's
that
it.
They know, and they'll come up. So the river and the salmon in an individual river will be genetically different quite often to the neighbouring rivers. So they're unique, like we have the Tamar salmon, which genetically distinct.
So you say migratory fish are suffering. How is the Atlantic salmon doing? We've just got a flyby.
Yes. So the Atlantic salmon, a few years ago before I joined the Tamar Valley National Landscape, I used to work with IUCN, which runs the Red List of Threatened Species. And one of the last species I assessed was the Atlantic salmon globally. And then all the ducks are coming in, having a good old chatter. So we looked at the whole of the Atlantic salmon, its whole range, to see how it's doing and whether it is basically threatened with. When we say a species threatened, it means what's the risk it'll go extinct if we don't do anything. If things remain, that's the key thing here. And most freshwater fish that are commercially important, and the salmon is one of them, we have quite good data on numbers. And so one of the criteria for looking at how well they're doing is, has the population increased or declined, which is the main basis for these assessments. And the Atlantic salmon globally comes out as near threatened, and that means that it just, if the decline in the species goes a little bit further, it'll then become a threatened species. And 3 categories of threatened species are vulnerable, endangered, and critically endangered. So we're getting into that realm where one of our most iconic species, salmon, one of the best known species, best studied, highly commercially valued, and a wonderful fish, is basically heading towards extinction. That's globally. In some areas doing okay, but then we looked at a number of genetically distinct subpopulations, one of which is for Great Britain. And Great Britain, it's actually endangered, so it's the second highest level of threat, purely because of the numbers. The decline in the numbers of individuals is really quite rapid. And so that's a major concern, and that assessment was done hoping to raise a bit of political profile on it, because I mean this is such a famous, well-known, important species, and for that to be heading for extinction in our lives due to activities of humans is not a great thing, and it has been picked up quite a lot. So just to put a figure on that, since 2006 there's been a 45% decline in the abundance of salmon in GB. That's not good at all. And the Tamar situation, narrowing it down to where we are, but we've just been talking to the chaps up at the weir on the fish trap, because this is the only index river in England where they monitor the entire life cycle of the salmon, which is looking at mortality at sea, how many go to sea, how many come back, how many spawning areas do we have, how many fry are there upstream. All that is monitored, and through the fish trap, which monitors what fish are coming back, going upstream to spawn. Last year was the lowest number going upstream yet recorded. Currently, salmon is considered classified as a freshwater species, but that means they don't monitor them in the marine bycatch, and that has to change, because I mean it spends a lot of its life at the sea anyway. There are lots of theories. Could be overfishing, climate change is changing ocean currents, feeding patterns. Any of these things could be going on. So in the meantime, what do we do in our river? Well, the most important thing is that we need the rivers to be in best possible condition for when the salmon does come back. And the ones that are coming up, if they have a really good run up the river and the conditions are really good, they'll spawn well, so they can keep the population going. So we do need to look after our freshwater component of the salmon life cycle and give them the best chance possible.
So threats to the salmon, why is the situation so serious?
The big threat is the poor marine survival. Say 100 go to sea, at the moment only 4 will make it back. So that's obviously a major issue. But within the river, issues we can address are water pollution. I mentioned earlier that the fish spawn upstream. They need really clear water with clean gravels to lay the eggs in. And land use can really, if it's not good, you can get heavy rain and the silt comes off the land, and that will silt up all these spawning areas, and they'll be no good to salmon at all. And if they've spawned already, the eggs will all die. So we want to intercept our sediment coming off the land, or just avoid it coming off the land at all. And we've also got basic water pollution, again coming off the land, sewage outflows, all of those things that can lead to either the water's becoming a bit toxic for salmon, or we get what we call eutrophication. It's a lot of nutrient goes into the water. That makes the algae grow, and it all turns green, and oxygen levels go down. Not good for the other insect life that's in there. I'll just give you a quote, because this is basically sums up the situation. This is a report on England's rivers. This is a government report. They described it as a chemical cocktail of sewage, agricultural waste and plastic is polluting the waters of many of the country's rivers. So that's where we're at. So we've got lots we can improve on. Another threat to salmon, commonly mentioned, is salmon farming or aquaculture. And as you probably know, there's not a lot of that going on down here. But the salmon that come to the West Country rivers they migrate past west of Ireland, where there are quite a lot of salmon farms, so it's possible there's an impact there. None of that is really very clear, so we can't make very clear judgments on that, even though I know there are a lot of groups who are quite serious advocacy that salmon farming is causing a major problem. Yes. But I wouldn't say it's one of the big issues down here. One thing that is quite interesting for the Tamar, another threat is invasive species. And in this case, it's a Pacific salmon. It's the pink salmon, and it was introduced to Russia quite a number of years ago for aquaculture or fisheries generally. It's done rather well, spreading fast. It's now a huge problem in Norway. They come up the rivers every 2 years to spawn. Thousands and thousands are being trapped in the Norwegian rivers because they're really threatening the Atlantic salmon. And the UK has a few, but the interesting thing is the most southerly record of the pink salmon is on the Tamar at Gunners Lake Weir, which was a few years back, and I don't think it's been seen since.
So what threat, are they a predator, or is it that they're using the spawning grounds?
It's more that, yes,
right.
More competing for the area.
Space.
Yeah, and what people can do, they look a bit different to the Atlantic salmon, but if you see something dead on the edge or in the water you're not sure about, doesn't look like a normal salmon, take a photo, report it.
Okay.
Because if they are coming in, last thing we want is for them successfully getting upriver and then starting to spawn and out-competing the Atlantic salmon. And the final one is more about climate change. I mentioned at sea,
yes,
ocean currents changing and so on, but within the rivers, the most obvious thing is increasing temperature, because the Atlantic salmon is a cold water species. That's why in the more southern parts of its range it's being lost in Europe because it's getting too warm. And our rivers, particularly for the young and the fry and the eggs hatching, temperatures could get too high upriver. And things we can do there, we can plant trees along the rivers, river tributaries, shade provided. It would be really important, something my sort of heart's in that one, to replace a lot of the riparian woodlands we had in the past. We're called buffer zones, where you don't farm right to the edge. You have an area, a strip along the edge, which is rougher ground with trees and bushes and meadows and ponds there, and the sediments will settle out there. And wetlands are really good for purifying the water. If you've got runoff of chemical pesticides or just high levels of nutrient, can all be intercepted in these wetlands. And the other thing is, if we can get very heavy rains and droughts and so on, heavy rain, you think, oh great, well that will get the fish migrating up the river nicely, but if it happens when they've spawned and the eggs are all in the gravels, very heavy rain can wash all the eggs out. So all these changing climates, but these can be helped by looking after our upper parts of the catchment.
So what can we do for those people listening? It is knowing that we all have a part to play, as we discussed this morning with Angela, thinking about what we're putting down our sink, how we use our water, how we go about our daily lives living within the Tamar or other river catchments. So what advice would you give to people wanting to continue to see the salmon and other migratory fish?
Oh, that's a tricky question, but I think, yes, as you said already, awareness starting off. A lot of people don't even know there are salmon in the river, so you're not going to get much support for something no one's heard of. So we need people to know the salmon are there, what fantastic fish they are, what they need to survive. And then I think it's just putting your voice behind, going to your local MPs and so on and saying, look, we want the water in the river to be suitable for salmon to come back. If it's good for the salmon, it's a really nice species to say that if the salmon is doing well, pretty much everything else in the river will be doing well. So to do that, and I think we start with the children who are growing up. If they grow up really concerned about what's happening in their rivers, linking them to their river systems. We have a project called the River Explorers, which West Country Rivers Trust are running for us, and that's really trying to make people realise rivers aren't just drains, but we put all our waste down. They're full of living creatures, and we want them to remain that way. Another thing you do, you can become a citizen scientist. Really good. You can go down to your rivers and you can do these kits you can get. West Country Rivers do one. There are others, and you can monitor what's going on in the water, help to get eyes and ears in many more places, so you'll feel empowered. There's work to reconnect some of our floodplains. A lot of rivers around the country are quite straight now compared to how they used to be. They're quite channeled, and all the areas they used to, in a big flood, the water would spread over these floodplains are now no longer possible. There's quite a lot of work on the Tamar, particularly down the bottom end here, to reconnect the floodplains. Some really great projects there. That's great because the water spreads out more, avoids the flooding for a start, and it will help to purify the water. The sediments can settle out, make conditions better in the rivers again, and you can do this upstream. There's a study going on the liner under Tamara, which is looking at the feasibility of a floodplain restoration there, connecting it more fully than it is now. So all these things, there's lots of options, but mainly just get behind conservation movements to. It is really important that we look after our rivers. As I said at the beginning, these are the arteries. Block these off, and if they're not functioning properly, the whole system will not be in good health.
Absolutely, and just thinking about the floodplain projects and riparian planting, that it's all multi-layered, isn't it? It's the actions we can take to have cleaner water, but the actions we can take on the land, and it having multiple impacts and benefits for all.
Yeah, and the difficult thing is to demonstrate that what you're doing has really helped, because it's very difficult. People might say you've been doing this work for years, the river's still looking muddy and everything, but you have to have a whole catchment approach, meaning the whole of all the land that's draining into the Tamar. Because if you really improve one area, but something is getting worse in another area, then the river's going to remain the same, even though you've improved your bit. So working on little sub-catchments, like we're doing in some of the projects, where all the farmers come together, you can really have a good chance to demonstrate, look, all farmers come together here, they're managing the land in this way, we're slowing down flows, recreating wetlands, and can monitor the water coming out the bottom there and really show that, that's made a big difference.
That's it.
So, and we need that at full scale of the whole
collective efforts.
Catchment approach, yes, but it is tricky, but bit by bit we can progress.
Absolutely. So for our listeners who are inspired and have gained lots from this podcast, if they want to come and see the salmon, where would you suggest?
Okay, well, the first thing is, when would you do it? And the best chance of seeing the salmon is in the spring, when the salmon are starting to come back up the rivers, and you go and park yourself by a weir, like this one in Tavistock, for example, Gunners Lake Weir, after some heavy rain, when the salmon are stimulated to swim upstream, and then you watch the weir, and if you're lucky you'll see the salmon starting to jump. When I was growing up, you could guarantee to see them coming up the weirs. Otherwise, in autumn time, if you live on a tributary of the Tamar, or can get to a tributary, if you look at some of the sort of gravelly areas, you might see, if you're lucky, that's where the salmon will spawn, and you'll either see them spawning, which would be very lucky, pairs of them, or you'll see a little indentation in the gravel, which is the red, where the female has cleared away the gravel, and laid the eggs in there, which will be a sort of lighter colour because they've scraped away all the algae-fied bits on the top. Otherwise, just during the summer time, if you wander down to a river, look for a nice pool, and you've got to sit there and watch and wait. And when I was growing up, I did a lot of that, and you'll see the salmon coming out, or they may just be swimming gently in the tail ends of pools along with the sea trout.
So, any last words from our conversation?
The Atlantic salmon, a lot of people call it the king or queen of fishes, and it's a beautiful fish, very well known, undergoes phenomenal migrations back to its river where it was spawned. It's commercially really important, probably one of the best studied fish on the planet, yet it's declining massively, so it's in serious trouble. And if we can bring the salmon back, the chances are that we'll bring a lot of other species with it, because it has to be able to survive up the upper catchment in the small streams, the whole river system, the journey back down to the sea, life at sea. If it can survive all those stages because conditions are favourable, then everything else will be doing well. And I think to do this we need to put pressure on our MPs. We all know that funding for environment is under pressure, but the most important thing is the land where we live and where all these species we live with. We have to look after it, and restoring salmon back to its former glory would be just great. It's an amazing species to see, so support is what we need.
Yeah. Okay, so just to finish off, picking up really on what you've said about that connection with where you live and your rivers and waterways. As part of the podcast, can you give us 3 things that just help you or make you now feel connected to nature?
Well, we're standing on the edge of a beautiful bit of the river, opposite a place called Impalm Meadows, and it's the peace and tranquility of the whole area, and you just hear the birds singing. And I used to spend quite a lot of time in my youth fiddling around on the edge of rivers, and if you sit still, you just see so much. So if you want to get really connected, just sit quietly and see what you can see. I think this morning you saw kingfishers.
We did.
And that, if you're rushing around, you won't see any of these things. You just want to take the time and soak it in.
Yeah, so it's not about the marching around and the doing it, just stop and look and listen.
And if you fish, you do a lot of that, because you don't ever catch anything, if you're me. And so you can spend a lot of time just relaxing there. I've been down on the river, actually at this point here, and heard a little plop, so stopped what I was doing, and an otter came out on the shingle bank, probably 15 feet in front of me, just sat there and looked at me.
Wonderful.
That was in the dusk, and then on it went. And those are the times you think, now we know why we need to look after these beautiful rivers.
Absolutely. Well, thank you very much for taking the time to come down to the river today. A good excuse, really, isn't it, to be here?
Yes, to tear ourselves away from our desks.
Absolutely.
No, I think we need to get out a lot more.
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you for listening to what has been another insightful and inspirational episode. From the topics discussed, it may be felt that it is a bleak view for our migratory fish on the River Tamar and other river catchments in the UK. However, we know what we need to do. Research needs to continue to find those unanswered questions, and it's time that we take action and make the difference that is required to our waterways and our species that are struggling. For me, again, having the opportunity to talk, learn and share such a wealth of knowledge from our guests is very empowering. My key takeaway from the conversations is the vital importance of continuing to raise awareness of the species in our rivers as well as on the land. The unwavering effort put in place to research and save the most threatened of species. How education is key to support all generations and communities to have a better understanding of the natural world in the land in which they live, and what we can all do to help on a landscape scale as individuals and communities. We all need to take responsibility for our actions to be the change, whether we're changing our household and domestic habits, farming practices and recreational interests. To take that time to sit, to wait, to look, to listen, and just connect with nature so that we understand it that little bit better. You have been listening to Nature Connects podcast from the Tamar Valley. Our thanks to Angela Gall and William Darwall for such wonderful conversation, and to Photo Now for their technical support. This podcast has been made possible thanks to the National Lottery Heritage Fund, supported Tamara Landscape Partnership Scheme. Please do like and subscribe to the podcast. Share, tell your friends. The more people that listen and engage, the more chance we have of making a collective difference. Until next time, thank you.